Welcome to episode 2 of Sequelology. Today's film is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, a sequel to the influential 1974 proto-slasher film of the same name. Part 2 was released a whopping 12 years after the original. To put that in some perspective, for horror cinema in the time between TCM 1 and TCM 2, we got 3 Halloweens, 3 Jaws films, 3 Amityville horrors, 6 Friday the 13th films, 5 Argento films, 3 Omens, 2 Romero Dead films, 2 Howlings, 2 Nightmare on Elm Streets. Hell, even Psycho got 2 sequels before the Texas Chainsaw Massacre got 1. To say nothing of all of the other slasher films of varying quality that drew from its influence, a genre so prolific it even acquired subgenres, like holidays. And it's not like Hooper had no clout. He worked steadily throughout the 70s and 80s, including his highest profile work, the supernatural family horror film Poltergeist. But a new Texas Chainsaw had never been in the cards. Hooper said he did kick around a script idea about a whole town of cannibals that he said would have been a, quote, satire of 1980s Motel Hell. But considering Motel Hell is already a comedy, that mostly just means he wishes he had made Motel Hell, since that film is both excellent and a perfect amplification of the themes of TCM taken in a more darkly comedic direction. By the mid-80s, Hooper was just planning on producing TCM 2, but they couldn't find a director. You gotta be judicious with that Cannon money. So Hooper signed on. Cannon apparently wanted a grim death march similar to the original TCM, but Hooper went in a very different direction for a very different era. The slasher boom born in TCM's wake had come and gone, and the mood in horror cinema in 1986 was much more about self-aware black comedy, case in point, the primary poster for TCM2 being a direct parody of the previous year's classic teen dramedy, The Breakfast Club, and ornate, over-the-top gonzo violence, typified by legendary makeup and prosthetic artist Tom Savini, who Hooper brought on board. Now, let's take a look at the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. The opening crawl looks to get us up to speed, recapping the events of the first film, and saying that authorities were never able to find the farmhouse, despite it being like a 3-minute walk from the family home of survivor Sally, who is alive and has somehow acquired a hyphenated second last name, but is never seen or mentioned in this film. Our protagonist instead is a local DJ named Stretch, who hears 2 dipshit frat boys get chainsaw murdered on her request line, and gets linked up with a rogue detective named Lieutenant Lefty Enright, who is apparently Sally and Franklin's uncle, cousin, brother? It's never really specified, but he's vaguely related, and that's why he cares. Lefty convinces Stretch to play the recording on the radio, which draws the attention of the old man, who gets a name, Drayton Sawyer, and runs an award-winning, secretly human meat-based chili food truck. He dispatches Leatherface and his heretofore unseen brother, Chop Top, who was in Vietnam during the first film and has a metal plate in his head. Stretch manages to escape because Leatherface is smitten with her, but she follows them to their colorful Alamo theme park-based compound and immediately gets trapped in their lair. Lefty follows too, and spends most of the second half of the film just yelling and sawing beams on his way in, which culminates in a climactic double battle for survival. What a strange artifact this is. The long layoff between original and sequel mean that while it is of a tone with horror in 1986, it has very little emotional or aesthetic relation to the original film. For its lengthy gestation, it's a very sloppy film, with its focus almost entirely on the gore effects and set decoration, at the expense of almost everything else. If Poltergeist was considered recognizably a Steven Spielberg film despite Hooper's presence, TCM2 could be considered recognizably a Tom Savini film, because Savini's art is so eye-catching and so specific that post-Dawn of the Dead, every film Savini worked on just sort of becomes a Savini film. The film is presented humorously, but it isn't actually funny so much as just sort of jittery and loud, and seems to think the oddness of its setting and the outrageous prosthetics are just inherently amusing. The film seemingly has no idea what story it wants to tell or how to tell it outside of its effects work. This especially comes through in the climax, which is shapeless and endless. This is the longest film in the TCM franchise at 101 minutes, and a good half hour of that is the repetitive chase fight climax. All three surviving characters from the original's villainous family return, but only one actor, Jim Sydow, does, and his character acquits himself the best. Expanding Drayton's backwoods human barbecue into a popular chili he's winning awards for is a great bit, and he's basically a charmingly maniacal cartoon version of himself. As for the other two, Grandpa's casting is basically meaningless, and it's ridiculous that he's even here. But the producers had a dispute with original Leatherface Gunnar Hansen, and spurned him because who's gonna notice? But it's very noticeable that this is a different Leatherface. He carries himself much differently, more athletic and comedic. The thing that was scary about Leatherface in the original wasn't just that he was violent, but that he didn't seem to process that it was at all wrong. And the first film spends a lot of time drawing comparisons between what the family's doing and what goes on at the local slaughterhouse. This Leatherface is kinda just some dweeb. Like if Flounder from Animal House had been raised in a family of cannibals. Stretch is a much more compelling protagonist than Sally was, and Caroline Williams does a good job keeping you emotionally invested in her perspective, but they seem to have almost nothing for Dennis Hopper to do, and once he enters the Sawyer lair, which comprises the entire second half of the film, he does almost nothing but chop beams and yell, and his lengthy chainsaw battle with Leatherface goes on forever, but gets no conclusion. Lefty seems to have won it, but does not appear in the final 10 minutes of the film. Once we switch perspectives to the chase fight between Stretch and Chop Top, we never see Hopper again, and none of the villains are decisively killed. The film just sort of stops. And honestly, if anyone in the film should be decisively killed based on their injuries, it's Leatherface. So it'll be interesting to see how he comes back 4 years later in the sequel. My guess? Entirely without explanation. As far as connections between the previous film and this one, things you'd need to have seen the first film to truly get, there's honestly very little. There is this blood logo showing up on another car, which I thought was a nifty detail. There's also a ludicrous scene where they suggest that Enright has discovered his relative Franklin's corpse, still in its wheelchair, still with its original flashlight with batteries inside this lair that is not where he died. They try to use it as some sort of motivational factor, but you're just like, excuse me? TCM2 opened at number 5 at the box office in the summer of 1986, but within 2 weeks it had disappeared from theaters entirely. It was just too odd, too violent, too ungainly, too unrelated to the classic original film it so belatedly followed up. And that's my final take too. It's a watchable curio, a decent gore effects spectacle with some fun moments and a likable protagonist, but no real compelling reason to exist. It is a fascinating, baffling way to follow up such a grimy, low-key classic. Up next, we predictably overcorrect the other way. Join me next time for the grim, violent return to form that is Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. Next time on Sequelology.